Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to see you today. If I haven't had a chance to meet you yet, my name's Jake, and I'm so glad you're joining us. I know we've got some family in town. We've got some recent grads. And so just real quick, shout out to you guys. Congratulations. Proud of you all. It's a big deal. Well, I'm excited that you're joining us today as we begin a new series on the practice of solitude, which is a practice straight from the way of Jesus or the life of Jesus. But I know that some of y'all might not be real familiar with the practice of solitude. It might sound a little weird to you because it does sound a little weird. And so just to get us started, let me tell you what solitude is. It's the practice of solitude is intentional time in the quiet with ourselves and God. It's intentional time in the quiet with ourselves and God. And just to give you an idea of why we are focusing on this practice for the next 4 weeks, let me tell you a story. Story begins on January 27th, 1956. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is sitting at his kitchen table in the middle of the night contemplating giving up. See, the day before, he had been arrested and jailed for driving 30 miles per hour in a 25 mile per hour zone. And he had been released the morning of the 27th, but he came home to just another onslaught of hostile, hate-filled phone calls. See, this is really happening in June 27, 1950. This is early on in the civil rights movement. Dr. King is not really widely known yet, not really on a national level yet, and yet he had come to Montgomery, Alabama to lead the bus boycott following Rosa Parks' courageous act of refusing to sit in the colored portion of the bus. But as the boycott just dragged on, Dr. King was feeling the weight of increasing hate and death threats directed his way, that he feared for his life and he feared for his wife and his daughter. And so on that night, he could not fall asleep. He got out of bed, he made a pot of coffee, he sat down at his kitchen table, and he began praying to God in the quiet. In a sermon that he would give later, he talks about this night, and he says this, quote, "And I bowed down over that cup of coffee, and I will never forget. I prayed a prayer, and I prayed out loud that night. I said, Lord, I am down here trying to do what's right, but Lord, I must confess that I am weak now. I'm faltering. I'm losing my courage." And he says, and it seemed at that moment that I could hear an inner voice saying to me, "Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness. Stand up for justice. Stand up for truth. And lo, I will be with you even to the end of the world." In his biography of Dr. King, the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian David Lewis makes the point that this was a defining moment in Dr. King's life, and as a result, a defining moment for the nation of America. Now, hypothetical scenario here. Just play along with me. What do you think would happen if Dr. King had an iPhone? Like, what if he sat down with his cup of coffee that night when he couldn't sleep, but instead of praying, he began to scroll through Insta or TikTok? What if he started reading his email and just was bombarded by even more hate? What if he had read the news and just started fuming over the most recent op-ed? Or what if he had Netflix And so what if, just to kind of numb all of the fear that he was feeling that night, he just sat down and began to binge a new show. See, I wonder if Dr. King had never been alone with God that night. If he had never heard God's voice calling him to stand up for justice and promising him his presence, God promising Dr. King his presence even in the midst of the hardship, I wonder if there would even have been a civil rights movement as we know it today. Thankfully, though, Dr. King did not have an iPhone or Netflix. But we do. We're the first generation in history trying to figure out how to follow Jesus in the digital age. And there are pros and there are cons with that, but I'll tell you, it's a unique challenge when we are always connected to the noise and the distractions of this world. Yeah, I'm old enough to remember this thing from the 90s. Some of y'all will be able to remember this too. It was called boredom, you know? It was really weird. Like you would go to a coffee shop and you would stand in line to order coffee, and that's all you would do. You would just stand in line. Like there was nothing else to do. You would just stand there. It was so weird. Like people sometimes would turn around and talk to you that you didn't know. It's like, what's happening, right? So yeah. But today, what do we do whenever we find ourselves standing in line or having even just a couple seconds of downtime or struggling with a sleepless night? According to a Microsoft survey, 77% say they reach for their phone when nothing else is occupying their attention. To me, that number actually hit me as low. I think it would probably be higher to 90%. I know, personally, that's what I often do, right? But listen, there's a downside to always being tethered to the noise of the world with something always available to distract us or to entertain us. Andrew Sullivan, the author, a few years ago had an essay that was in the New York Times Magazine entitled, "I Used to Be a Human Being." How's that for a title? In his essay, he tells the story of checking into a digital detox center where he had no access to his phone or computer for multiple days. And he says that over time, he began recalling memories from his childhood and from his abandoned Catholic faith. In the essay, he makes this statement. He says, "The reason we live in a culture increasingly without faith is not because science has somehow disproved the unprovable, but because the white noise of secularism has removed the very stillness in which it might endure or be reborn." Then he goes on with this great line. He says, "If churches came to realize that the greatest threat to faith today is not secularism, but distraction, perhaps they might begin to appeal anew to a frazzled digital generation." I could not agree more. Sullivan ends his essay in this way. He says, "This new epidemic of distraction is our civilization's specific weakness. And its threat is not so much to our minds, even though they shapeshift under the pressure. The threat is to our souls. At this rate, if the noise does not relent, we might even forget that we have one." Friends, what if the greatest threat to the Christian faith and our own soul isn't secularism, but distraction? Could it be that Ronald Rolheiser, the Catholic priest and theologian, is right when he says that we are distracting ourselves into spiritual oblivion? See, I wonder how many moments I have missed when God had something to say to me, but I was distracted by my devices. And I wonder how many moments you have missed and God had something to say to you as well, but you were distracted by your devices. Friends, what if we intentionally set aside time to turn off the distractions and escape the noise of this world so that we could be present to God in the quiet. To put it another way, what if we began to practice solitude? I mean, I wonder what would happen. What kind of what kind of impact could that have to our ability to hear from God and for our souls to come alive? When you read the Gospels, it becomes very clear that solitude was a core and essential practice in the life of Jesus. In fact, there's this fantastic line of the Gospel of Luke, chapter 5, that comes right after Jesus has healed a man with leprosy. Let me just read it for us. Luke chapter 5, verse 15 says, "The news about Jesus spread all the more so that the crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sickness." Like Jesus is in high demand, but here's the key statement: Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. That phrase, lonely places, that kind of sounds a little ominous, right? Lonely places. It's like, oh, who's lonely? No, that it means, it's actually, that phrase is one word in the Greek. It's the word eremos. And eremos can be translated lonely places, but it can be translated deserted places or the desert or the wilderness or solitary place, or my favorite is the quiet place. And in Jesus' day, especially in Israel, most people lived in like small little like villages, and then outside of the villages were just like lots of uninhabited land, right? And that uninhabited land, that was called the eremos. And so Jesus would sneak off. He would withdraw to the eremos to get alone with God, the Father, and pray. Which means that he wouldn't just get away, withdraw just to get some me time, right? Like this isn't Jesus like trying like, I need a day off, I just, so many people wanting to be healed, I just got to get away from, I need to catch up on a side project or watch a movie while I'm folding laundry or whatever it might be. That's not what Jesus is doing. He's getting away specifically to pray with the Father. And the gospel writer Luke, he doesn't tell us what the content of this prayer time was. But if I was to venture a guess, my guess would be that most of this time of prayer was not Jesus asking the Father for things. That was not what we refer to as prayers of petition. And that prayers of petition, request things from God, is great. It has its time and place, and it's a really good thing. But my guess is this time for Jesus, that when he would withdraw to the lonely places to pray, to be with the Father, this looked a lot more like what Jesus talked about in John 15 when he talked about abiding. That this looked like communion with the Father or resting in the Father. That this is a type of prayer that looks a lot more like rest than work. That it's a time where he just was able to enjoy the presence of his Father, who is the source of all life and love. Where he would withdraw from the noise, the hurry, and the distraction just to come and to rest in God. And notice, Luke tells us that he would do this often, that Jesus often withdrew to lonely places. Like this was his regular rhythm to his life. In fact, in the Gospel of Luke alone, we see Jesus do this 9 different times. Like this was a regular rhythm. And when he would do it, and I personally find this extremely challenging, but that he would do this the busier that he got. And that the more in demand that he was in, the more he would slip away to the Ramos to get alone with the Father. And we go in the opposite direction, don't we? Busier we are, the more responsibilities we have, the more people that need us, the less time we spend in the quiet with God, and the less time we give attention to our interior lives. But for Jesus, getting alone with the Father was not a luxury. that he indulged in only whenever he had extra time for it. Now, instead, it was a core practice in his life that he made time for no matter what. In fact, when you read the Gospels, you notice that there was this rhythm to his life of retreat and return, retreat and return. That Jesus would retreat into solitude, like he would go and get away from people, from the noise, from the stimulation, and to pray and to rest and to listen to the Father's voice. But he wasn't a hermit. He would then return to be with people, to love them and to serve them. That there was this back and forth rhythm between solitude and community in the life of Jesus. And so it comes as no surprise that Jesus taught his followers, his apprentices, his disciples, to follow that example, to live in community. He taught them to do that by having them what? Live in community. But he also taught them to make time, to get alone with the Father and pray. One of the main places he taught this was in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6. Right, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about three practices or three spiritual disciplines. They are almsgiving and prayer and fasting. And what he has to say about prayer is really interesting, because especially when you just pay attention to his initial teaching, what he really focuses in on at the beginning of teaching about prayer, it's all about where to pray and why to pray. He doesn't have actually anything to say initially on the content of what you should pray. It's where and when. Like, look what he says. Matthew chapter 6, verse 5, Jesus says, and when you pray, and notice that word when, right? Pastors love to point this out. It's not if, it's when. Jesus expects his followers, right, to devote themselves to prayer. But he says, when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. Again, notice, Jesus doesn't say anything about the content of their prayers here. Then he says, but when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. And then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. So he put another way, Jesus is saying that when you pray, get alone with God and pray for him, not to be seen by others. Get alone with God. Now, quick aside, this doesn't mean that you can't pray with other people, right? We see Jesus and his followers all throughout the New Testament praying together, his followers praying with the churches that they're part of. All that stuff is great and very good. But this also doesn't mean that you shouldn't make it your habit to also get alone with God and pray. Like Jesus is saying, this is what I'm teaching you to do when it comes to prayer. This is what he taught his followers to do. When you pray, get by yourself and God. Practice solitude, just as he modeled in his life. See, my point is, in the Gospels, you find story after story of Jesus getting alone with the Father, and you see him teaching his followers to do the same, which all goes to highlight that solitude was the core practice in the way of Jesus. Perhaps this is why so many followers of Jesus say solitude is one of the most important of all of the spiritual practices. For example, Henry Nouwen once said, without solitude, it is virtually impossible to live a spiritual life. And then he's really blunt. He says, we do not take the spiritual life seriously if we do not set aside some time to be with God and to listen to him. Now, that's blunt, but that makes logical sense, right? I mean, if you want to have a deep relationship with anybody, you have to make time to get alone together, spend time, just you and them. I mean, Krista and I, if we didn't practice getting time just together, we would drift apart. which is why, on most weeknights, we go on a walk at night, just me and her, to be able to catch up on our day and to connect. It's why most weekends we go on a date together just to get time, just to process life together, to catch up, and to enjoy one another. If we don't have that time, our relationship would greatly suffer. Y'all know this, right? Well, the same is true with our relationship with God. You have to carve out time to be alone together if you want to enjoy a deep, intimate relationship with Him, which is why, friends, I'm so excited that we're doing this practice. It's why we need to recapture the practice of solitude. And so let's get practical here, all right? What exactly is the practice of solitude? Well, let me first just tell you what it's not, okay? Because it's a little weird. It feels like it could be easily misunderstood. So first thing I want you to know is that solitude is not the same as isolation. I love this quote by the Hawaiian pastor Wayne Cordero. He says this: "There is a difference between isolation and solitude. They contain similar characteristics, but in reality, they are worlds apart. Solitude is a chosen separation for refining your soul. Isolation is what you crave when you neglect the first." That's really good. See, isolation is a movement away from relationships, but solitude is a movement towards relationship with God that then enables, as you spend that time alone with Him, enables you to then move towards relationship with others with the ability to love well. So solitude is not the same as isolation. It's also not the same as aloneness. Aloneness. Yeah, aloneness is what introverts love, right? It's when you're not with other people. It's like, that sounds like heaven. But often when we're not with other people, what are we doing? We're texting people, or we're scrolling through social media, or we're just being entertained by whatever we're watching, or whatever it might be. And those things, that's just not solitude. This is a different thing. See, this is a crucial distinction because many people mistakenly assume that solitude is a preference-based spiritual discipline for introverts. There's an idea that if you're an extrovert and you just want to be around people and be in community and whatever, all that kind of stuff all the time, it's like, this is not for me. But that's a tragedy to think that way, because there is an intimacy and deepness of relation with God that is only experienced when you get alone with Him. This is not the same as aloneness. This is not the same of like, I just have to be around people. In solitude, you are with someone. That someone is the God of the universe, your Savior and friend. See, introverts, if you think, where this can get messed up for introverts is if you look at solitude as just a time to just get away from people, then that will also be to your detriment, because then you can skew this practice of solitude to really just be an excuse for a little me time. And again, that's not what solitude is either. It's time with you and God together. I said it earlier to open up the message, but the definition of solitude is this. The practice of solitude is an intentional time in the quiet with ourselves and God. Intentional time in the quiet with ourselves and God. Ruth Haley Barton, who wrote a great book on this topic called Invitation to Silence and Solitude. It's a recommended reading that goes along with this practice. You'll see us recommend that in our guide here. But in it, she says this about solitude. She says, solitude at its most basic and profound level is simply an opportunity to be ourselves with God. I like that. Again, that's why this is not the same as aloneness. You're not alone, you're alone with God. And throughout church history, a key companion to solitude has been silence. That's why in this definition we talk about getting alone in the quiet with God. It's when you are quiet and your environment is quiet. When you seek to silence the external noise, right? where you turn off your devices, perhaps leave the phone in another room or in the house while you leave the house, which is like, oh man, can you do that? Yes, you can do that. Turn off the TV, turn off the music, get rid of all the external inputs. Don't do it in a crowded coffee house. Do it while the kid is sleeping or at school, or your spouse isn't around, your roommates aren't around, and you just get in the quiet with God. That's the first part of silence. You silence the external noise. You also aim, and this is much, much harder said, much harder to do than it is just to say it here. But you also seek to silence the internal noise, where you try to get still and you take some deep breaths and you let go of the to-do list for a minute and you try to tune out all the other voices in your head to where you can just focus in on the voice of God. So that's silence. So you silence the external noise and you at least attempt to silence the internal noise as well. And friends, I'll tell you, like I practice solitude each morning after I take my kids to school or after my 6 a.m. meetings on Thursday and Fridays. And but sometimes I let the busyness of my life crowd out this time. And when I do, there are a few things that I begin to notice starts happening in my soul, in my body. First, I just noticed that I feel distant and out of touch with God. That I'm just not as aware of His presence throughout the day or His voice. Second thing that happens is I find myself getting more and more reactive. That I get sucked into the tyranny of the urgent, but not always the important. That I can begin to lose God's perspective on my life, on what matters and what really doesn't matter, what He would have me give my time towards. I feel, around, tossed by the winds, just doing whatever is put in front of me instead of clear direction. Third thing that happens is I find I just get more tired, which is kind of weird, but it's true. What I do is that when I'm not running to that time alone with God, to be refreshed by Him, to be able to process life with Him, then where is that staying? It's all staying here. And it just wears me out. And so I run out of energy to do what's truly life-giving, and I usually end up shifting from engagement to escapism. The entertainment, social media, overeating, etc. I become more emotionally unhealthy and on the edge, where even the little things can make me lose my temper and get short with my family or become more susceptible, vulnerable to temptation. See, all of these things are signs of what happens whenever I neglect the practice of solitude. Perhaps you can relate to those things. But when I am regularly practicing getting alone in the quiet with God, I find that I'm able to decompress from the overstimulation of the world, and I'm able to come to a place of calm. It's really amazing what will happen if you would just spend 5 minutes in the complete quiet. Like, I mean, it sounds so weird if you never do that. But like your body you'll begin to breathe better. You'll feel yourself relax a bit. It's just to turn off the noise and all of the stimulation. In addition to that, I begin to feel. I become aware of the good and the bad, the hard that's going on. And I'm able to process that with God, which is so helpful. And then the third thing is that as I practice solitude, I hear God speak to me primarily through his word. That things just jump off the page where I just like, oh, that was for me, or I needed to hear that. But sometimes not, sometimes, and I know this can sound weird to many of y'all, but like sometimes I hear from God in a very personal way. And it's incredibly refreshing to my soul. And it affirms who I am in Christ and how God feels about me, that he loves me. And it is a big, big deal to how I enter each day. See, friends, time alone with God, I would say, is severely underrated. And it is so, so good, which is why I would like to invite all of you to begin practicing this. Now, a couple of things on that. First, in order to practice solitude, you don't have to go out into the wilderness to do it, okay? Now, if you're able to, go for it. That's great. Happy for you on that. And there's, man, times to definitely do that. But you could practice solitude simply by walking to a park down your street or sitting in your backyard at night or at your kitchen table before your family or roommates wake up. For me, my go-to place is a chair in my living room, or the couch in my office. But the key is just to find a place that is as quiet and distraction-free as possible so you can enjoy being fully present to God. Now, having said that, let me just name this reality, okay? There is something in all of us that resists following Jesus into solitude, that will make all kinds of excuses, and they will feel like very valid excuses, right? I'm an extrovert. This is not for me. I have young kids at the house. I don't have that luxury. Life is just so busy. Work is just insane. I just don't have the time for it right now. And friends, listen, I hear you and I get it. I have been there. I am often there. Those excuses or those statements of reality are reality. It's hard. Busyness is an obstacle that has to be overcome if you're going to practice solitude. But listen, I say this with all the love I can. You can overcome it. Jesus was super busy, but he often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. I mean, he was super, super busy. I mean, walking down the roads, people clinging to him, teaching, and people digging through the rooftop to come and be in front of him. Walking on the roads and people yelling from the side, Jesus, come save me, come heal me. Like everywhere he went, he was in high demand. People had so much to do. And all of that while he was literally saving the world, right? Jesus was really busy. And yet, with all the demands and all the responsibilities and all he was trying to accomplish, he made time to regularly get alone with the Father. Maybe he actually made time because of all the demands, because of all the responsibilities, because of all the things he had to do. He realized he had to have that time with the Father. Could it be that he carved out that time to practice solitude because time alone with the Father was what he longed for? And also because he knew how much he needed it in order to live a life of love. And could it be that by his way of life, Jesus was teaching us that in order to have life-giving communion with God and to become people who love well, we too need to make it our practice to often get alone with God in the quiet place. See, I know adopting this practice will be difficult for many of you. But again, out of love, let me just say, you can do this. You can do this. Just start small. Don't try to start where I am or where someone that you look up to is. Just start with your next step. If that's 10 minutes every other day, fantastic. Just take your next step. Move forward with Jesus. That said, I do want to be clear here. Jesus does not command you to practice solitude. In fact, very few of the spiritual disciplines are ever commanded. Jesus doesn't command you to read scripture. He doesn't command you to live in community. He doesn't command you to go to a worship service. Instead, Jesus just did all of those things. And then he invited all of us by saying, come, follow me. Come follow me. Which means that you're not commanded to do this, but you are absolutely invited to do this. Ruth Haley Barton, in that book I quoted earlier, said this: the invitation to solitude and silence is just that. It is an invitation to enter more deeply into the intimacy of relationship with the one who waits just outside of the noise and the busyness of our lives. It's an invitation to communication and communion with the one who is always present, even when our awareness has been dulled by distraction. It's an invitation to the adventure of spiritual transformation in the deepest places of our being, an adventure that will result in greater freedom and authenticity and surrender to God than we have yet experienced. I like our imagery of God waiting for us outside the noise and busyness of our lives. Waiting to speak to you, to comfort you, to breathe courage into your heart, and to love you. But the truth is, God is not waiting outside of busyness to be present with us. He is always with us. But we are the ones who are often not with him. That it's the business of our lives that distract us from the reality that he is always with us. Which is why, friends, the practice of solitude is so extremely important, where we intentionally make time to get alone with God, to give him our undivided attention, to hear from him and talk to him and process life with him and just enjoy being with him. That as you make this your practice, one of the things that you will find is that you will become more aware of his presence with you throughout the day by beginning your day alone with him. See, ultimately, the practice of solitude is an invitation to intimacy with God. And so, if you want to come close to God, then I invite you to follow Jesus into the quiet place. To help you do that, we put together this handy dandy solitude practice guide. And I just want to point this out to you real quick. If you don't have one of these, we passed them out last week, but if you didn't grab one and you weren't able to be here, we have a lot more in the lobby. Please pick one of these up. They're free. They're a gift to you, and these are going to prove, I think, super helpful for you in this practice. That what I would really encourage you to do this week is to read through the beginning of this practice guide up to week 1, and then to follow along with it this week. And that what you'll find in there is that a section where we actually lay out a specific exercise that we are inviting you to do this week to help you begin practicing solitude. It's titled Practice. And the week 1 practice is this. It's to begin your day with a few minutes, just a few minutes of solitude and silence and stillness and prayer. That's it. Just a few minutes. Now, some of y'all, this is a practice that you already have. If so, man, praise God. keep it up. And you might be like, I could actually do more than a few minutes. That's great. In this guide, you'll see that we also included something we're calling reach practices. And reach practices are for those of you who would like to go deeper into this practice, to take another step. And so I encourage you to consider that as well. But friends, feel no pressure to do that. There's no one grading you, okay? Start where you are. Start with your next step and follow Jesus into the quiet. We will use this guide in our MCs. And so bring them with you to your Midtown community meeting during the week. You'll use it to process and talk about this stuff together. If you're not a part of a Midtown community, those are small groups that meet during the week. This is a perfect time to join one. They will help you begin to actually practice this. So it'll be a place of encouragement for you and a place to process this with you. And so if you would like to begin this, practice of solitude, I'd really encourage you to begin it in community with people so that you can go into the solitude together, which kind of sounds weird, right? But it's helpful to have others there doing this too, and y'all can process together. So if you aren't part of an MC, I encourage you to sign up for one today. You can do that on the connection card or the QR code, okay? So anyways, that's a little bit about this practice guide. I really encourage you to interact with this. We worked really hard on it, and I think it's going to be really helpful for you, okay? Make sure I've said everything there. Okay. I'm really excited about this. And I think that this is going to really honor God. We'll make time to intentionally get alone with him. And I think it's going to be so good for your souls and for mine as well. So let's do this. Now, to wrap up, we're going to take communion together as we do each Sunday. And so servers, you can begin passing out the communion elements. And as they begin passing out the communion elements, I do want to call out one more obstacle, one more thing that will keep us from practicing solitude. And that specifically is a lack of desire to be with God. If you lack desire to be with God, that you're not going to intentionally make time to get alone with him. I understand that. I've been there. That's why the practice of communion is so incredibly helpful. Because listen, friends, when we partake in communion together, we are remembering how very deeply God desires to be with us. We are remembering how much God desires to be with us. See, in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 18, we're told, Christ suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous to what? To bring you to God. See, on the cross, Jesus not only suffered physically, having his body broken and his blood spilled for us, but he also suffered being forsaken by the Father. That the eternal Son was cut off from the Father, suffering the loss of a relationship so that we could be reconciled to God through Christ Jesus, through what he was willing to suffer for us. Friends, if Jesus was willing to suffer in this way, physically, emotionally, relationally, being forsaken by the Father, all in order to bring us to God, to make the way for us to be reconciled with God and to be with him. If that is how deeply he wants to be with us, then what does that tell you? Gosh, it tells you that he loves you like crazy. He loves you, and he longs to be with you. So as we take communion in just a second all together, may what we are taking here speak to your heart. God loves you. He wants to be with you. May that move your heart to want to be with him.